Chapter 16 I found her in the old neighborhood near the blackberry swamp, where my mother lived and where Lop Ear and I had built our first tree shelter. It was unexpected. As I came under the tree, I heard the familiar soft sound and looked up. There she was, the Swift One, sitting on a limb and swinging her legs back and forth as she looked at me. I stood still for some time. The sight of her had made me very happy. And then an unrest and a pain began to creep in on this happiness. I started to climb the tree after her, and she retreated slowly out the limb. Just as I reached for her, she sprang through the air and landed in the branches of the next tree. From amid the rustling leaves she peeped out at me and made soft sounds. I leaped straight for her, and after an exciting chase the situation was duplicated. For there she was, making soft sounds and peeping out from the leaves of a third tree. It was borne in upon me that somehow it was different now from the old days before Lop Ear and I had gone on our adventure journey. I wanted her, and I knew that I wanted her, and she knew it too. That was why she would not let me come near her. I pursued her from tree to tree, and ever she eluded me, peeping back at me with kindly eyes, making soft sounds, and dancing and leaping and teetering before me, just out of reach. The more she eluded me, the more I wanted to catch her, and the lengthening shadows of the afternoon bore witness to the futility of my effort. As I pursued her, or sometimes rested in an adjoining tree and watched her, I noticed the change in her. She was larger, heavier, more grown up. Her lines were rounder, her muscles fuller, and there was about her that indefinite something of maturity that was new to her, and that incited me on. 3 years she had been gone, 3 years at the very least, and the change in her was marked. I say 3 years. It is as near as I can measure the time. A 4th year may have elapsed, which I have confused with the happenings of the other 3 years. The more I think of it, the more confident I am that it must be 4 years that she went away. Where she went, why she went, and what happened to her during that time, I do not know. There was no way for her to tell me, any more than there was a way for Lop Ear and me to tell the folk what we had seen when we were away. Like us, the chance is she had gone off on an adventure journey, and by herself. On the other hand, it is possible that Red Eye may have been the cause of her going. It is quite certain that he must have come upon her from time to time, wandering in the woods, and if he had pursued her there is no question but that it would have been sufficient to drive her away. From subsequent events I am led to believe that she must have traveled far to the south, across a range of mountains and down the banks of a strange river, away from any of her kind. Many Tree People lived down there, and I think it must have been they who finally drove her back to the horde and to me. My reasons for this I shall explain later. The shadows grew longer, and I pursued more ardently than ever, and still I could not catch her. She made believe that she was trying desperately to escape me, and all the time she managed to keep just beyond reach. I forgot everything, time, the oncoming of night, and my meat-eating enemies. I was insane with love of her, and with anger too, because she would not let me come up with her. It was strange how this anger against her seemed to be part of my desire for her. As I have said, I forgot everything. In racing across an open space, I ran full tilt upon a colony of snakes. They did not deter me. I was mad. They struck at me, but I ducked and dodged and ran on. Then there was a python that ordinarily would have sent me screeching to a tree top. He did run me into a tree, but the Swift One was going out of sight, and I sprang back to the ground and went on. It was a close shave. Then there was my old enemy, the hyena. From my conduct he was sure something was going to happen, and he followed me for an hour. Once we exasperated a band of wild pigs, and they took after us. The Swift One dared a wide leap between trees that was too much for me. I had to take to the ground. There were the pigs. I didn't care. I struck the earth within a yard of the nearest one. They flanked me as I ran, and chased me into 2 different trees out of the line of my pursuit of the Swift One. I ventured the ground again, doubled back, and crossed a wide open space, with the whole band grunting, bristling, and tusk gnashing at my heels. If I had tripped or stumbled in that open space, there would have been no chance for me. But I didn't. and I didn't care whether I did or not. I was in such mood that I would have faced old Saber Tooth himself, or a score of arrow-shooting Fire People. Such was the madness of love with me. With the Swift One, it was different. She was very wise. She did not take any real risk, and I remember on looking back across the centuries to that wild love chase, that when the pigs delayed me, she did not run away very fast, but waited rather for me to take up the pursuit again. Also, she directed her retreat before me, going always in the same direction she wanted to go. At last came the dark. She led me around the mosey shoulder of a canyon wall that outjutted among the trees. After that we penetrated a dense mass of underbrush that scraped and ripped me in passing. But she never ruffled a hair. She knew the way. In the midst of the thicket was a large oak. I was very close to her when she climbed it, and in the forks, in the nest shelter I had sought so long and vainly, I caught her. The hyena had taken our trail again, and he now sat down on the ground and made hungry noises. But we did not mind, and we laughed at him when he snarled and went away through the thicket. It was the springtime, and the night noises were many and varied. As was the custom at that time of the year, there was much fighting among the animals. From the nest we could hear the squealing and neighing of wild horses, the trumpeting of elephants, and the roaring of lions. But the moon came out and the air was warmed, and we laughed and were unafraid. I remember next morning that we came upon two ruffled cockbirds that fought so ardently that I went right up to them and caught them by their necks. Thus did the Swift One and I get our wedding breakfast. They were delicious. It was easy to catch birds in the spring of the year. There was one night that year when two elk fought in the moonlight, while the Swift One and I watched from the trees, and we saw a lion and lioness crawl up to them unheeded and kill them as they fought. There is no telling how long we might have lived in the Swift One's tree shelter. But one day, while we were away, the tree was struck by lightning. Great limbs were riven, and the nest was demolished. I started to rebuild, but the Swift One would have nothing to do with it. As I was to learn, she was greatly afraid of lightning, and I could not persuade her back into the tree. So it came about, our honeymoon over, that we went to the caves to live. As Lop Ear had evicted me from the cave when he got married, I now evicted him, and the Swift One and I settled down in it, while he slept at night in the connecting passage of the double cave. And with our coming to live with the horde came trouble. Red Eye had had I don't know how many wives since the Singing One. She had gone the way of the rest. At present he had a little soft spiritless thing that whimpered and wept all the time, whether he beat her or not, and her passing was a question of very little time. Before she passed even, Red Eye set his eyes on the Swift One, and when she passed, the persecution of the Swift One began. Well for her that she was the Swift One, that she had that amazing aptitude for swift flight through the trees. She needed all her wisdom and daring in order to keep out of the clutches of Red Eye. I could not help her. He was so powerful a monster that he could have torn me limb from limb. As it was, to my death, I carried an injured shoulder that ached and went lame in rainy weather, and that was a mark of his handiwork. The Swift One was sick at the time I received this injury. It must have been a touch of the malaria from which we sometimes suffered, but whatever it was, it made her dull and heavy. She did not have the accustomed spring to her muscles, and was indeed in poor shape for flight when Red Eye cornered her near the lair of the wild dogs, several miles south from the caves. Usually she would have circled around, beaten him in the straight away, and gained the protection of our small-mouthed cave. But she could not circle him. She was too dull and slow. Each time he headed her off, until she gave over the attempt and devoted her energies wholly to keeping out of his clutches. Had she not been sick, it would have been child's play for her to elude him. But as it was, it required all her caution and cunning. It was to her advantage that she could travel on thinner branches than he, and make wider leaps. Also, she was an unerring judge of distance, and she had an instinct for knowing the strength of twigs, branches, and rotten limbs. It was an interminable chase. Round and back and forth, for long stretches through the forest they dashed. There was great excitement among the other folk. They set up a wild chattering that was loudest when Red Eye was at a distance, and that hushed when the chase led him near. They were impotent onlookers. The females screeched and gibbered, and the males beat their chests in helpless rage. Big Face was especially angry, and though he hushed his racket when Red Eye drew near, he did not hush it to the extent the others did. As for me, I played no brave part. I know I was anything but a hero. Besides, of what use would it have been for me to encounter Red Eye? He was the mighty monster, the abysmal brute, and there was no hope for me in a conflict of strength. He would have killed me, and the situation would have remained unchanged. He would have caught the Swift One before she could have gained the cave. As it was, I could only look on in helpless fury, and dodge out of the way and cease my raging when he came too near. The hours passed. It was late afternoon, and still the chase went on. Red Eye was bent upon exhausting the Swift One. He deliberately ran her down. After a long time she began to tire, and could no longer maintain her headlong flight. Then it was that she began going far out on the thinnest branches, where he could not follow. Thus she might have got a breathing spell, but Red Eye was fiendish. Unable to follow her, he dislodged her by shaking her off. With all his strength and weight, he would shake the branch back and forth until he snapped her off as one would snap a fly from a whiplash. The first time she saved herself by falling into branches lower down. Another time, though they did not save her from the ground, they broke her fall. Still another time, so fiercely did he snap her from the branch, she was flung clear across a gap into another tree. It was remarkable the way she gripped and saved herself. Only when driven to it did she seek the temporary safety of the thin branches. But she was so tired that she could not otherwise avoid him, and time after time she was compelled to take to the thin branches. Still the chase went on, and still the Folk screeched, beat their chests, and gnashed their teeth. Then came the end. It was almost twilight. Trembling, panting, struggling for breath, the Swift One clung pitiably to a high, thin branch. It was 30 feet to the ground, and nothing intervened. Red Eye swung back and forth on the branch farther down. It became a pendulum, swinging wider and wider with every lunge of his weight. Then he reversed suddenly, just before the downward swing was completed. Her grips were torn loose, and screaming, she was hurled toward the ground. But she righted herself in midair and descended feet first. Ordinarily, from such a height, the spring in her legs would have eased the shock of impact with the ground. But she was exhausted. She could not exercise the spring. Her legs gave out under her, having only partly met the shock, and she crashed over on her side. This, as it turned out, did not injure her, but it did knock the breath from her lungs. She lay helpless and struggling for air. Red Eye rushed upon her and seized her. With his gnarly fingers twisted into the hair of her head, he stood up and roared in triumph and defiance at the awed folk that watched from the trees. Then it was that I went mad. Caution was thrown to the winds. Forgotten was the will to live of my flesh. Even as Red Eye roared, from behind I dashed upon him. So unexpected was my charge that I knocked him off his feet. I twined my arms and legs around him and strove to hold him down. This would have been impossible to accomplish had he not held tightly with one hand to the Swift One's hair. Encouraged by my conduct, Big Face became a sudden ally. He charged in, sank his teeth in Red Eye's arm, and ripped and tore at his face. This was the time for the rest of the Folk to have joined in. It was a chance to do for Red Eye for all time. But they remained afraid in the trees. It was inevitable that Red Eye should win in the struggle against the two of us. The reason he did not finish us off immediately was that the Swift One clogged his movements. She had regained her breath and was beginning to resist. He would not release his clutch on her hair, and this handicapped him. He got a grip on my arm. It was the beginning of the end for me. He began to draw me toward him into a position where he could sink his teeth into my throat. His mouth was open, and he was grinning. And yet, though he had just begun to exert his strength, in that moment he wrenched my shoulder so that I suffered from it for the remainder of my life. And in that moment something happened. There was no warning. A great body smashed down upon the four of us locked together. We were driven violently apart and rolled over and over, and in the suddenness of surprise we released our holds on one another. At the moment of the shock, Big Face screamed terribly. I did not know what had happened, though I smelled tiger and caught a glimpse of the striped fur as I sprang for a tree. It was old Saber Tooth. Aroused in his lair by the noise we had made, he had crept upon us unnoticed. The Swift One gained the tree next to mine, and I immediately joined her. I put my arms around her and held her close to me while she whimpered and cried softly. From the ground came a snarling and a crunching of bones. It was Saber Tooth making his supper off of what had been Big Face. From beyond, with inflamed rims and eyes, Red Eye peered down. Here was a monster mightier than he. The Swift One and I turned and went away quietly through the trees toward the cave, while the Folk gathered overhead and showered down abuse and twigs and branches upon their ancient enemy. He lashed his tail and snarled, but went on eating. And in such fashion were we saved. It was a mere accident, the sheerest accident. Else would I have died there in Red Eye's clutch, and there would have been no bridging of time to the tune of 1,000 centuries down to a progeny that reads newspapers and rides on electric cars, aye, and that writes narratives of bygone happenings even as this is written. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. It was in the early fall of the following year that it happened. After his failure to get the Swift One, Red Eye had taken another wife. And strange to relate, she was still alive. Stranger still, they had a baby, several months old, Red Eye's first child. His previous wives had never lived long enough to bear him children. The year had gone well for all of us. The weather had been exceptionally mild and food plentiful. I remember especially the turnips of that year. The nut crop was also very heavy, and the wild plums were larger and sweeter than usual. In short, it was a golden year. And then it happened. It was in the early morning, and we were surprised in our caves. In the chill gray light we awoke from sleep, most of us, to encounter death. The Swift One and I were aroused by a pandemonium of screeching and gibbering. Our cave was the highest of all on the cliff, and we crept to the mouth and peered down. The open space was filled with the Fire People. Their cries and yells were added to the clamor, but they had order and plan, while we Folk had none. Each one of us fought and acted for himself, and no one of us knew the extent of the calamity that was befalling us. By the time we got to stone throwing, the Fire People had massed thick at the base of the cliff. Our first volley must have mashed some heads, for when they swerved back from the cliff, 3 of their number were left upon the ground. These were struggling and floundering, and one was trying to crawl away. But we fixed them. By this time we males were roaring with rage, and we rained rocks upon the 3 men that were down. Several of the firemen returned to drag them into safety, but our rocks drove the rescuers back. The Fire People became enraged. Also, they became cautious. In spite of their angry yells, they kept at a distance and sent flights of arrows against us. This put an end to the rock throwing. By the time half a dozen of us had been killed and a score injured, the rest of us retreated inside our caves. I was not out of range in my lofty cave, but the distance was great enough to spoil effective shooting, and the Fire People did not waste many arrows on me. Furthermore, I was curious. I wanted to see. While the Swift One remained well inside the cave, trembling with fear and making low wailing sounds because I would not come in, I crouched at the entrance and watched. The fighting had now become intermittent. It was a sort of deadlock. We were in the caves, and the question with the Fire People was how to get us out. They did not dare come in after us, and in general we would not expose ourselves to their arrows. Occasionally, when one of them drew in close to the base of the cliff, one or another of the Folk would smash a rock down. In return, he would be transfixed by half a dozen arrows. This ruse worked well for some time, but finally the Folk no longer were inveigled into showing themselves. The deadlock was complete. Behind the Fire People I could see the little wizened old hunter directing it all. They obeyed him and went here and there at his commands. Some of them went into the forest and returned with loads of dry wood, leaves and grass. All the Fire People drew in closer. While most of them stood by with bows and arrows, ready to shoot any of the Folk that exposed themselves, several of the Fire Men heaped the dry grass and wood at the mouths of the lower tier of caves. Out of these heaps they conjured the monster we feared, fire. At first wisps of smoke arose and curled up the cliff. Then I could see the red-tongued flames darting in and out through the wood like tiny snakes. The smoke grew thicker and thicker, at times shrouding the whole face of the cliff. But I was high up, and it did not bother me much, though it stung my eyes, and I rubbed them with my knuckles. Old Marrow Bone was the first to be smoked out. A light fan of air drifted the smoke away at the time so that I saw clearly. He broke out through the smoke, stepping on a burning coal and screaming with the sudden hurt of it, and essayed to climb up the cliff. The arrows showered about him. He came to a pause on a ledge, clutching a knob of rock for support, gasping and sneezing and shaking his head. He swayed back and forth. The feathered ends of a dozen arrows were sticking out of him. He was an old man, and he did not want to die. He swayed wider and wider, his knees giving under him, and as he swayed he wailed most plaintively. His hand released its grip, and he lurched outward to the fall. His old bones must have been sadly broken. He groaned and strove feebly to rise, but a Fire Man rushed in upon him and brained him with a club. And as it happened with Marrow Bone, so it happened with many of the Folk. Unable to endure the smoke suffocation, they rushed out to fall beneath the arrows. Some of the women and children remained in the caves to strangle to death, but the majority met death outside. When the Fire Men had in this fashion cleared the first tier of caves, they began making arrangements to duplicate the operation on the second tier of caves. It was while they were climbing up with their grass and wood that Red Eye, followed by his wife, with the baby holding to her tightly, made a successful flight up the cliff. The Fire Men must have concluded that in the interval between the smoking out operations we would remain in our caves, so that they were unprepared, and their arrows did not begin to fly till Red Eye and his wife were well up the wall. When he reached the top, he turned about and glared down at them, roaring and beating his chest. They arched their arrows at him, and though he was untouched, he fled on. I watched a third tier smoked out, and a fourth. A few of the Folk escaped up the cliff, but most of them were shot off the face of it as they strove to climb. I remember Long Lip. He got as far as my ledge, crying piteously, an arrow clear through his chest, the feathered shaft sticking out behind, the bone head sticking out before, shot through the back as he climbed. He sank down on my ledge, bleeding profusely at the mouth. It was about this time that the upper tiers seemed to empty themselves spontaneously. Nearly all the Folk not yet smoked out stampeded up the cliff at the same time. This was the saving of many. The Fire People could not shoot arrows fast enough. They filled the air with arrows, and scores of the stricken Folk came tumbling down. But still there were a few who reached the top and got away. The impulse of flight was now stronger in me than curiosity. The arrows had ceased flying. The last of the Folk seemed gone, though there may have been a few still hiding in the upper caves. The Swift One and I started to make a scramble for the cliff top. At sight of us, a great cry went up from the Fire People. This was not caused by me, but by the Swift One. They were chattering excitedly and pointing her out to one another. They did not try to shoot her. Not an arrow was discharged. They began calling softly and coaxingly. I stopped and looked down. She was afraid and whimpered and urged me on. So we went up over the top and plunged into the trees. This event has often caused me to wonder and speculate. If she really were of their kind, she must have been lost from them at a time when she was too young to remember. Else would she not have been afraid of them? On the other hand, it may well have been that while she was their kind, she had never been lost from them, that she had been born in the wild forest far from their haunts. Her father may be a renegade Fire Man. Her mother may be one of my own kind, one of the Folk. But who shall say? These things are beyond me, and the Swift One knew no more about them than I did. We lived through a day of terror. Most of the survivors fled through the blueberry swamp and took refuge in the forest in that neighborhood. And all day hunting parties of the Fire People ranged the forest, killing us wherever they found us. It must have been a deliberately executed plan. Increasing beyond the limits of their own territory, they had decided on making a conquest of ours. Sorry for the conquest. We had no chance against them. It was slaughter, indiscriminate slaughter, for they spared none, killing old and young, effectively ridding the land of our presence. It was like the end of the world to us. We fled to the trees as a last refuge, only to be surrounded and killed, family by family. We saw much of this during that day, and besides, I wanted to see. The Swift One and I never remained long in one tree, and so escaped being surrounded. But there seemed no place to go. The Fire Men were everywhere, bent on their task of extermination. Every way we turned we encountered them, and because of this we saw much of their handiwork. I did not see what became of my mother, but I did see the Chatterer shot down out of the old home tree. And I am afraid that at the sight I did a bit of joyous teetering. Before I leave this portion of my narrative, I must tell of Red Eye. He was caught with his wife in a tree down by the blueberry swamp. The Swift One and I stopped long enough in our flight to see. The Fire Men were too intent upon their work to notice us, and furthermore, we were well screened by the thicket in which we crouched. Fully a score of the hunters were under the tree, discharging arrows into it. They always picked up their arrows when they fell back to earth. I could not see Red Eye, but I could hear him howling from somewhere in the tree. After a short interval, his howling grew muffled. He must have crawled into a hollow in the trunk. But his wife did not win this shelter. An arrow brought her to the ground. She was severely hurt, for she made no effort to get away. She crouched in a sheltering way over her baby, which clung tightly to her, and made pleading signs and sounds to the Fire Men. They gathered about her and laughed at her, even as Lop Ear and I had laughed at the old Tree Man. And even as we had poked him with twigs and sticks, so did the Fire Men with Red Eye's wife. They poked her with the ends of their bows and prodded her in the ribs. But she was poor fun. She would not fight. Nor, for that matter, would she get angry. She continued to crouch over her baby and to plead. One of the Fire Men stepped close to her. In his hand was a club. She saw and understood, but she made only the pleading sounds until the blow fell. Red Eye, in the hollow of the trunk, was safe from their arrows. They stood together and debated for a while, then one of them climbed into the tree. What happened up there I could not tell, but I heard him yell and saw the excitement of those that remained beneath. After several minutes his body crashed down to the ground. He did not move. They looked at him and raised his head, but it fell back limply when they let go. Red Eye had accounted for himself. They were very angry. There was an opening into the trunk close to the ground. They gathered wood and grass and built a fire. The Swift One and I, our arms around each other, waited and watched in the thicket. Sometimes they threw upon the fire green branches with many leaves, whereupon the smoke became very thick. We saw them suddenly swerve back from the tree. They were not quick enough. Red Eye's flying body landed in the midst of them. He was in a frightful rage, smashing about with his long arms right and left. He pulled the face off of one of them, literally pulled it off with those gnarly fingers of his and those tremendous muscles. He bit another through the neck.